Olá a todos.
The Obsession with Dominicans. I Know Black. Welcome to Afro-Latinas United, and welcome to This Might Offend You. In this series, I'll be diving into some topics that might not be commonly discussed, but I believe they are crucial to understanding our identity and navigating the world as Afro-Latinas. I want to talk about things that might be uncomfortable or even controversial to some, but necessary to address. In this series, we'll also explore the privileges we as Afro-Latinas may have and how we can use them consciously. Trigger warning. Before we dive into today's topic, I want to acknowledge that this conversation will explore complex issues around race and identity, particularly within the Dominican community. I understand that these topics can be deeply personal and that people may have very different perspectives on them. If you come from a background or viewpoint that differs from mine, I encourage you to approach this discussion with an open mind. My goal is not to invalidate anyone's experience or understanding, but to offer my own insights as an Afro-Brazilian Latina that is not American and who views race and identity through a different lens. If at any point you feel discomfort, please take a step back and reflect on how these issues might resonate differently for all of us. Let's move forward with respect and understanding. In a world where identity is more fluid than ever, the question of who are we often leads to deep and sometimes uncomfortable conversations. But when it comes to Dominicans, these conversations can take on a unique intensity, particularly when race is involved. One common example that often circulates online is the joke about Dominicans saying, "I know black." This phrase has become something of a meme, poking fun at how some Dominicans may reject the label of black despite their African heritage. However, these jokes miss the nuance behind identity in the Dominican Republic and many other Afro-Latino communities. Today, I want to share my perspective as an Afro-Latina and explore why there's such an obsession with labeling Dominicans as black. It's important to note that I'm not American, and my views might be more nuanced compared to what you hear in the American context. I grew up with a different approach to race and identity, and I look at these issues through an Afro-Brazilian lens. My upbringing was somewhat unique. I come from a family that has a mix of different cultural and ethnic influences. We were always very proud of our culture, but race was rarely a topic of discussion. That's something I want you to keep in mind as we move through this discussion. You can grow up knowing that you're of African descent, but that aspect of your identity might not be explicitly emphasized. Let's dive in. Historical context. To understand this obsession, we first need to go back in time. The Dominican Republic, like many Caribbean nations, has a complex history rooted in colonization, slavery, and the blending of various cultures. The island of Hispaniola, which the Dominican Republic shares with Haiti, has been a melting pot of indigenous, African, and European influences for centuries. But this shared island has also seen its fair share of conflict. Haiti, predominantly black and with a revolutionary history, stands in contrast to the Dominican Republic, which has often emphasized its mixed heritage. This contrast has fueled a historical tension that continues to influence how Dominicans see themselves and how they are perceived by others. National identity and race. In the Dominican Republic, identity is often tied more to nationality and culture than to race alone. This is something that may be difficult to grasp, especially for those accustomed to the American perspective, where race is often placed at the forefront. As an Afro-Latina myself, I can relate to this nuanced experience. Growing up in a Brazilian family, we knew we were of African descent, but it wasn't something that was constantly emphasized. It was just part of who we were, woven into the fabric of our culture, but not the defining feature. For many Brazilians, and I believe for other Afro-Latinos as well, our national identity comes first. This doesn't mean we are not proud of our African roots. In fact, it's deeply embedded in our traditions, clothing, music, and food. But we don't always express it explicitly. Our heritage is often present in a more implicit way, part of our everyday lives. In Latin America, and also in Europe, it is more common to emphasize nationality over race. In contrast, the American perspective tends to focus more on racial identity. As someone married to a Hispanic American, I've seen firsthand how different the approach to race and identity can be. In American media, it often feels like there is a kind of taboo around putting nationality first and race second. But for many Latinos, including myself, that's how we were raised. For us, it's not about ignoring or denying our roots, but about seeing our culture and national identity as an integral part of who we are. Colorism and different perspectives on race. There's more to this story, though. Colorism, the preference for lighter skin that exists across many cultures, also plays a role in how race is viewed in places like the Dominican Republic. But in Latin America and Europe, there's a key difference: the one-drop rule, which is so central to racial classification in the U.S., doesn't exist in the same way. In the U.S., if you have any African ancestry, you're often automatically classified as Black. But in many Latin American countries, race is viewed more fluidly, shaped by a mix of ancestry, appearance, and cultural context. This has shaped how race is understood and experienced in these regions. Without the one-drop rule, people can be seen as a blend of various heritages without being forced into rigid categories. This doesn't mean race isn't important. It just means it's experienced differently. And there needs to be room for that way of understanding race alongside the American perspective. This is where misunderstandings can arise. For some Dominicans, much like other Afro-Latinos, identity is tied to their nation and culture first, and race second. So when outsiders, especially those from the U.S., try to impose a binary racial label, it can feel like a misrepresentation of how they see themselves. Reclaiming identity. Despite these challenges, many Dominicans are reclaiming their identities on their own terms. The Afro-Latino movement has given many the language and platform to celebrate their African roots, while also embracing their full identity as Dominicans. This movement highlights the need for multiple perspectives on race and identity, allowing space for both the American view of race and the more nuanced, nationality-first view found in Latin America and Europe. So why the obsession with Dominicans and their racial identity? Perhaps it's because Dominican identity challenges the more rigid ways the American perspective often thinks about race and identity. But I believe it's a beautiful reflection of the complexity of human identity. Maybe it's time we move beyond trying to fit people into boxes and start appreciating the beautiful complexity of identities like those in the Dominican Republic. In places like Latin America and Europe, race and nationality can be seen differently. And while the American perspective has its place, we need to recognize and accept that there are other valid ways to experience and understand race. Dominicans should be free to define themselves as they see fit, without the pressure of external labels. After all, identity is about more than just skin deep. It's the story we carry within us, shaped by our past and how we choose to define our future. As a Brazilian, I've shared my understanding and experience in trying to explain these complexities, but I recognize that I may have missed something. If you're Dominican, or if you have a similar experience or different insights, I encourage you to share your thoughts. Together, we can build a fuller picture of what it means to embrace who we are. If this resonates with you, please leave a comment and let's start the conversation. What does identity mean to you? How do you prioritize the different aspects of your identity? Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay proud of all parts of who you are.
Tchau, até a próxima vez!